Thank you everyone for joining today. I'm Betsy Lopez-Wagner, Principal at Lopez-Wagner Strategies, and I'll be moderating today's panel. I've worked alongside attorneys and lobbyists and coalition partners to safeguard the health of communities, protect clean air and water, fight Arctic drilling, and protect the ocean and our public lands. My work is motivated by the community where I was born and grew up, a neighborhood outside of Chicago, surrounded by industrial facilities. I'm on the board of directors for the Xerces Society, a business advisory council for NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, and a chair of its Equitable Experiences Working Group. As someone who is actively involved in grassroots level organizing and community projects and supporting organizations doing social good, I'm so excited to be here today alongside an incredible panel. So a quick reminder to everyone, a bit of housekeeping. So again, this is a live public recorded webinar. A recording of today's panel will be shared with all attendees following this session. We also note that this panel is being attended by members of the media. If you're a reporter, a journalist, and are participating in today's event in that capacity, please indicate that by adding media or press to your display name. There will also be some information in the chat that can give you instructions on how to do just this. So another reminder, the Zoom chat is open for attendee participation. However, racist, misogynistic, mean-spirited, and other offensive comments won't be tolerated. Individuals who do not adhere to keeping the chat friendly will be removed from today's program, and the chat function may also be disabled. And to ensure we're hearing from you all, we will be taking questions from the audience. We ask that you use the Q&A button to submit yours. We will not be pulling questions from the chat, only again from that Q&A section. So we'll try to get to as many audience questions as possible. Now that we are beyond housekeeping for this panel, let's go ahead and ground our heads and our hearts back in the lands where we call home. So it is essential that we acknowledge the places that are public lands, those ancestral homelands, current homelands of Indigenous peoples. As noted in the People, Public Lands, and Climate Collaboratives framework, from time immemorial, the Indigenous inhabitants of North America have been conscious stewards of the land. Public lands were created from the forced removal of Native communities, and management of these lands has often prioritized extraction. Given that Indigenous peoples are proven caretakers of the natural world, public lands should be managed to protect sacred sites, counter Indigenous erasure, and respect tribal sovereignty. In noting that, I'd like to share that I'm joining y'all today from the lands of the Ottawa and the Peoria in Western Michigan, an area that is of important cultural and natural resources, as well as a place of sustenance by many who do hunting and fishing. I also note today that I'd like to pay homage to my ancestral homelands, the lands where my family has come from, the lands of the Purepecha and the Chichimecas. If you don't already know your ancestral homelands or the lands where you're residing now, please go ahead and look in the chat. We're going to share how you exactly can get tuned in to hear more about the lands that you're on and the treaty rights, and really be able to learn more as you move on to make sure that we are ensuring that Indigenous-led conservation is something that we all show up in allyship for. So again, you can find out that information at native-land.california. So to do a little bit of grounding, the intention for today's discussion is really to better understand how fossil fuel development on public lands fuels pollution and ultimately the climate crisis. We will do this while elevating the stories of impact, possibility, and community-led solutions. The work is deeply personal for many of us. Behind the data, the stats and numbers are people and communities. So please listen deeply to learn, to reflect, and to engage humbly. Before I introduce our panelists, we'd like to do some level setting with a couple of poll questions for our audience. So the first question you'll be seeing momentarily, poll question 1, is specific to understanding the climate emissions on public lands and waters. So number 1, about how much of the US total annual climate emissions stem from fossil fuel development on public lands and waters? Is that 5%, 15%, or 25%? And we'll give a few moments for folks to go ahead and respond to that poll question. Again, about how much of the US total annual climate emissions stem from fossil fuels developed on public lands and waters? 5%, 15%, or 25%? Excellent. It looks like we're still getting responses. Thanks to you who are out there answering these. And poll number 2, how many acres of public lands are leased to the oil and gas industry? Is this up to 5 million acres, about the size of New Jersey, up to 10 million acres, about the size of Maryland, or up to 25 million acres, about the size of Tennessee? Again, how many acres of public lands are leased to the oil and gas industry? 5 million acres, about the size of New Jersey, up to 10 million acres, about the size of Maryland, or up to 25 million acres, about the size of Tennessee? So we'll go ahead and give about 30 seconds for folks to go ahead and wrap those up. Okay, so for poll question number 1, for those of you, it looks like about 65% who said 25% is the total annual climate emissions stemming from fossil fuels developed on public lands and waters. You are correct. That is the correct answer, 25%. And yes, I see some of you all saying, wow, it is tremendously large. And for number 2, how many acres of public lands are leased to the oil and gas industry? From those of you who went ahead and selected up to 25 million acres, that is accurate. Now, if you guessed incorrectly, there's no shame. Please make sure you forgive yourselves. Again, this is a space of learning. The term public lands refers to lands managed by the government for public community use and benefit, and includes national parks, refuges, monuments, forests, deserts, and grasslands, as well as state and local open spaces. And given the public use and benefit part, many people automatically assume these lands are protected from fossil fuel development. But as you'll hear from our panelists today, that's not always true. And so without further ado, our panelists are going to dig in deeper to this public lands reality and what it means for all of us. So our first panelist today is Cyca Maupin. Cyca grew up in Fairbanks, Alaska, where they currently reside. They are the director of the Sovereign Inupiat for a Living Arctic, focusing locally on human health and wellness, looking at the mentality, physically, and spiritual aspects of all. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Cyca for a few words.
Hello, everyone. Pakalagipsi, welcome. Uvanga Cyca aningaranga utkia kuvikni, akaga Harriet Maupin, apaga Raymond Maupin, savaktinga Sovereign Inupiat for Living Arctic Director. So I did my traditional introduction. My name is Cyca, and kind of going over what was already stated. I'm really grateful to be here, so thank you. Go ahead and give it back.
All the thanks to you. Our next panelist today is Natalie Nebin. Natalie is a sustainability and policy expert with extensive grassroots organizing, fundraising, and campaign experience. She was Sierra Club National's Dirty Fuels lobbyist from 2015 until July of 2019, fighting the expansion of oil and gas and pipelines and working to protect public lands. She was the United States Policy Director of 350.org, where she worked to influence our federal government to phase out fossil fuels and justly transition to a 100% clean, renewable energy economy. Today, as the Senior Director for Climate Solutions for the Wilderness Society, Natalie fights to preserve public lands and find solutions to the climate crisis. Natalie?
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here today. And I'm really happy that we get to dive into the climate impacts of public lands and the fossil fuel development that happens on them. And thank you for everyone who, took the poll and really got to see what amount of fossil fuels really comes from our lands. It is surprisingly a lot, which is why here at the Wilderness Society, we're working very hard to justly transition off of fossil fuels.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Natalie. And rounding out our panel is Kaylee Shoup. Kaylee was born and raised in Carlsbad, New Mexico. After graduating from Interlochen Arts Academy, she pursued a career as a performer. In 2018, she moved back to her hometown and quickly realized that the community she called home had been transformed by the Permian oil boom. Within a year of returning home, she watched an abnormal number of young people in her life deal with a devastating diagnosis. And so her passion for environmental activism was truly awakened. She began working with Citizens Caring for the Future, the only climate advocacy group in her region in 2020. And she feels incredibly grateful to know and to work with other concerned individuals. She also works with grassroots activists and environmental stewards in the Permian Basin region. Haley?
Hello, everyone. I'm coming to you from the land of the Mescalero Apache people in Carlsbad, New Mexico, and I'm so happy to be speaking with such a large and wonderful group today. So thank you.
Thank you so much again, Sikanik, Natalie, and Kaylee. So again, just an abundance of gratitude to our panelists and to the communities where they come from as they're here today. So now let's go ahead and dive into our discussion. So this first question is specifically for Natalie. Natalie, I'd love if you could just help us to set the stage. So paint us a picture of the cycle we're talking about. How have public lands become a climate problem?
Well, the way that it, just as a brief overview of how it works, companies identify regions, areas, acres that they would like to lease. And then the Department of the Interior, which is in charge of issuing leases, both onshore as well as offshore for drilling. Overall, they, go through a process where the Department of the Interior will then issue a lease sale and the different acres will go to the highest bidder. After that, companies then require a drilling permit. So they request that, they go through another process for that. And majority of the time, those permits are issued. It doesn't mean that they have to develop that land that they've gotten a permit for. They can actually hold drilling permits for quite some time without developing it. In fact, right now, there are well over 9,000 unused drilling permits that the fossil fuel industry has. And so a lot of times they hold on to their permits depending on what is most profitable for them in terms of development and the price of oil overall and gas. So that's how it sort of works overall. There's different lease sales that occur different times a year, different requirements. The process for offshore drilling is a little bit different. They have these 5-year plans, which are essentially lease sales that are planned for particular dates over the next few years. And over time, this has been happening for, many, many decades. And oil and gas companies hold, as we saw in the poll, millions of acres across the country.
Excellent. Thanks so much for painting that picture for us. Our next question is for Kaylee. So Kaylee, the Permian Basin is recognized as one of, if not the largest, climate carbon bombs in the world. We know that in 2019, it surpassed the Ghawar oil field of Saudi Arabia to become the most prolific oil producing shale basin on our planet. It's pretty grave. What does fossil fuel development and climate change look like in your community in Southeast New Mexico? Can you share a bit more about that with us?
Of course. So as you said, it's pretty grave, and the Permian Basin is a pretty large problem. Not only what's going on here is not only harmful to my community, but impacts the world over. And so a little bit about the Permian Basin. It is primarily a shale basin that is 250 miles wide and 300 miles long. So it's very large. It's located in West Texas and Southeast New Mexico. And it's pretty much split in half by the two states. So the majority of the production that you're seeing in Texas takes place on private land, and the majority in New Mexico takes place on public land. And for reference, New Mexico is the only top oil producing state to recover to pre-pandemic levels. And this is, again, largely driven by the Permian fracking oil boom. So, this has impacts not only on the ground, but as I mentioned, in the world over. So New Mexico has some of the strongest methane rules in the country. And for those, I'm sure everyone here knows, but for those who don't, methane is a pollutant that is emitted during oil and gas production, and it has 80 times the warming impact of CO2. It does not stay in the atmosphere quite as long. So when we cut methane emissions, it's really a great toggle to actually lower the amount of warming that's happening. And so, as I said, New Mexico has some of the strongest methane rules in the country, but unfortunately, they are rarely enforced. For reference, New Mexico has roughly 55,000 wells statewide, and we have one air inspector for every 18,333 wells. So the issue of pollution is very out of control here. So bad that the entirety of the Permian Basin, so West Texas and Southeast New Mexico, is actually being investigated by the EPA to declare us a non-attainment zone based off of the number of high ozone days that we're seeing that are above the national ambient air quality standard. And so while it's depressing that we're at that point, if we do get this designation, it will actually be great because it will free up funding, more regulation will come into place, more monitoring, and then hopefully we can see the cutting of some of these emissions in the Permian Basin. But because of this out of control problem, this pollution problem, that would take a small army to properly regulate the oil and gas industry here, I believe strongly in not compounding the problem by adding more production in New Mexico. That means on public lands. And so we really already have issues dealing with what is already here and properly enforcing rules and regulating the industry. So it does not make sense to continue with new production. And then on the ground impacts that we're seeing, obviously this air pollution has impact on health, but in the past 5 years, from 2017 to 2022, in my home county, Eddy County, we've actually seen a 40% increase of folks living in what we call the oil and gas threat zone. So that's within a half mile of an oil and gas site. So, this has direct impacts on the health of children, elderly people, really everyone in this community, because along with methane, you're getting things emitted like volatile organic compounds, and that's benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, xylene, and benzene is a known carcinogen. So we really are seeing health impacts on the ground that are associated with these things. And then also in the local community, you're seeing a high cost of living because you have such a large influx of workers and not enough housing to cover that. We have overran schools. I recently spoke with a school administrator, and they're trying to build new schools, so all of these children have a place to go. And he said that he actually could not find land that was not within a half mile radius of an oil and gas site where he could build a school. And that was something that was important to him. And so that's just some on the ground impacts that you're seeing. Ran down infrastructure, so roads that are very, very dangerous, daily car wrecks. And then also increased seismic activity near our national parks. So I'm in Carlsbad. The Carlsbad Caverns are here. Just 2 weeks ago, about 4 miles south of the caverns, there was a 4.5 magnitude earthquake. And this is from the injection wells. And that's something that we don't usually see, but it's popping up more and more. People in the community are feeling these. It's threatening our caves, also water sources. And so that's just a little bit of the on the ground impacts and effects that we're seeing from this Permian oil boom.
Thank you so much, Kaylee, and also for really taking us to that hyper local level. I can hear your passion for really wanting to work, against all of this. So thanks for that unwavering commitment. For our next question, we'll go ahead and turn it over to Cyca. So we know that there's another major oil and gas project that's up in the Western Arctic. It's inching its way along to potential reality, the ConocoPhillips proposed Willow Project. I know that you and many others alongside your community have been working to fight to really stop this. Can you tell us what's going on? Like what's at stake for your community with this Willow Project specifically? And what are the climate and community impacts of oil and gas development in Western Arctic more broadly?
Yeah, thanks for asking. The Willow Project is massive. This is a proposed project that would completely surround a small village where my mother, my grandparents are from, Nuqsit. It would be 250 wells, 37 miles of roads, 386 miles of pipelines and airstrips, and a processing facility. And they actually were brought down in a lawsuit this year or last year. Now the time is kind of going into each other, but they had stated that they would have, 250 million metric tons of CO2 that would be released into the atmosphere over 30 years. And that would be equivalent to the annual emissions of 66 coal plants. After the lawsuit, that stated that this was unethical. It went against two major environmental policies. They actually came back and said that it would be equivalent to 76 coal power plants, and it would be 287 million metric tons. And what we're seeing from the draft environmental impact statement is stating that this is going to affect the community of Nuqsit significantly. This is going to threaten their food security. The pipelines would be put right in the way of the migration path of the Tisukbuk caribou herd. This is also going to affect the health and wellness of people in Nuqsit and in the North Slope. There was recently a toxics and pollutants report that came out and the implications to Nuqsit, and they talked about rare cancers like leukemia, which we have seen in the village with children. We have seen asthma rise 50% since the establishment of oil and gas near Nuqsit. And this is a human rights violation, human rights issue, but it also goes on the global impact of climate change and how this is going to be not just the emissions of the 287 million metric tons, but they actually estimate we're going to be getting many more barrels of oil from this project. So they're already talking about expansion without actually putting the permits in. And so we estimate that this is going to be, one of the largest in North America that will be fueling, the climate change, and also in the Arctic that is warming at 4 times the rate. And on top of all of that, in the last record of decision and the draft environmental impact statement, it said it would significantly increase mental health illnesses like depression, anxiety, and including suicide. Suicide is one of the top causes of death for Inupiaq people and Indigenous people in North America. So it's really impacting us in so many different levels, and on a local level, a national level, and an international level. And we need to choose the no action alternative, which is what we have been fighting right now. The hearings are currently happening. I'm going to be entering a hearing right after this to testify, where we have had 3 rounds of testimonies now for the same exact project because it's been so problematic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and really for taking us through that journey also of what this looks like from a mental health, emotional, a whole physical space. I can see in the way that you've been talking about this. I mean, this is something that you all have been working so hard against. And again, thank you for that, for the work that you do. Please also, this community that we have here, this audience, make sure that you hold us accountable to be good allies to you as well. Let us know how, as you're heading into these testimonies, we can help to elevate your voice, what we can do in terms of who can we call, where are those petition signatures. I know at the end of our conversation we're going to have a bit of that, but just please, especially for me, I welcome you to reach out and hold us all accountable to be able to be those good stewards alongside you all. Now, as we look to the broader panel, I think as we look at Kaylee and Cyca, as you've been talking about community, what are some of the biggest challenges to breaking this fossil fuel driven cycle in your region or communities? And then tell us a bit about how you all are rooting yourselves in community led, community driven solutions, just transition solutions, and so on. Cyca, Kaylee.
I can go first. The challenges that we've met is that it's one of the only ways of getting jobs, income, taxing. The North Slope taxes the oil and gas industry, and that is what pays for a lot of commodities that we have. Having a just transition plan that is really kind of difficult in the Arctic because it's one of the harshest places in the world, has been a huge challenge. But one of the ways that we've stayed grounded in community is definitely going and speaking to people that are in these communities that are most impacted and taking their lead. And an example of that is our sign-on letter that we created. We have, choosing the no action alternative, but we also, although we're keep it in the ground group and we don't believe in any more development, we do want to support the local efforts. And some of those local efforts are ways that there has been safety precautions that were left by community members' comments, like not having the pipelines going through the migration routes, being able to keep the subsistence and having less flaring, having the methane releasing, having more regulations, and those have been completely watered down by the Bureau of Land Management. So one of our asks in the sign-on letter is specifically the asks of the community on top of the no action alternative. And I think it's really important that although we may have these optimistic values and we want to live and strive by those, we also want to listen to those that are the most impacted and know that right now on the ground, people are inhaling pollutants and toxics. This is a war on our health and our bodies, reproductive rights, and this being able to be an advocate for those people currently is one of the ways that I think being grassroots is so impactful. Thanks.
As Signic mentioned, one of the challenges we have as well is it is the main source of well-paying jobs in this region. And so that's something that we're always concerned about. Something I would also say that the Permian is up against is, we have the most untapped reserves of any basin in the country. And then we also have relatively low break-even costs. And then also the Permian is responsible for the bulk of US exports. And so, geopolitics and what's going on in the world at large, global demand for oil plays a large role in the Permian. So we're really up against a behemoth in a lot of ways. And so I would say that that's one thing that is difficult to handle. And there's a lot that can be done on the local level, but it is limited. There's a lot of things going on around us that we really can't control. And then also the majority of the state budget in New Mexico also comes from oil and gas. So really any administration you get in is very favorable. And then the other thing that particularly in the Permian Basin is an issue is kind of the culture of the region. So this is West Texas and Southeast New Mexico. It's an area that is very politically red, and the overall sentiment here is drill baby drill, right? And as I mentioned in the beginning, Citizens Caring for the Future is the only grassroots environmental advocacy group in the whole of the Permian Basin, at least to our knowledge. We have yet to find anyone else. So, really just even getting people to kind of stand up and question the oil and gas industry is something that we struggle with, and we're always kind of striving towards. Part of the reason, they're not willing to speak out, a lot of people are employed, but then also the communities and community programs here are often funded by oil and gas majors. Now, this is not in a systemic way that would really, take care of a lot of these problems, but it's more in a, they give back strategically, and it kind of breeds that goodwill. And so something we're working on is, getting more community programs here that are not funded by oil and gas majors, and also school programs that discuss things like climate change with children. They're seeing climate change every day, and they're feeling the impacts of it. But a lot of time in this community, the language isn't there to talk about these things and to really hold space for what is happening and to talk about solutions. And so that's something that we're also, striving towards doing. And then also just we're fighting back by educating and most of all protecting folks. So the reason that I'm in this work is because of the health impacts that I saw around me when I moved back here. And so we're just doing things like, canvassing campaigns to let people know if they're living within a half mile of oil and gas infrastructure and some of the health impacts that could come with that. Things they can do, things they can tell their doctor to make sure they, track these symptoms. Tell your doctor if you live next to a compressor station, things like that. And then we're also working to get, air purifiers into people's homes that are living near these sites so that their air is a little bit cleaner to breathe. Just so really practical things like that, because, so many folks truly care about their health in all of these areas. Everyone cares about their health. Health is wealth. And folks, working in the oil industry aren't always aware of the health impacts that can come with that. And so we really want to help empower people to know what is happening and in their bodies and kind of the risk that they're taking on. And then we're also encouraging folks in this region, to look forward. As I mentioned, the Permian has a lot of untapped reserves. So as global oil demand goes down, the Permian will probably be the place that kind of fills that little bit of demand. And so it could be easy for us to kind of get left behind in it all. So we're encouraging folks to really look forward and think about how we can protect our resources here, our land, our water, so that we have a place where we can actually diversify our economy in the future and not kind of be totally left behind just with a ravaged landscape and ravaged resources.
Thank you so much. And, I think, Natalie, looking over at you now, there's a lot of movement. There's a lot of momentum building in communities. What can you tell us about those challenges at the national and federal level, and also how we can all help to create that change that is so necessary?
Absolutely. The federal level is very important. It's the Department of the Interior, which is, a federal agency that determines which lands are offered up for leasing. But, we've seen this sort of roadblock at the federal level, mainly from Congress, in terms of really pushing to wind down drilling and to really fight for the climate. And I know we just saw the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which we at TWS also supported. But even with this great federal legislation that really invests heavily in clean energy, it had some compromises built in. And those compromises were unfortunately our public lands and waters. That same legislation that we're very happy we have, it can reduce our emissions up to 40% by 2030, which is what we're pushing for. It also had compromises of mandated offshore and onshore leasing by the Department of Interior. And traditionally, the Department of the Interior would issue and say how many leases they're willing to offer. This bill requires a minimum amount in order to pursue clean energy on public lands. Now, there's a lots of clean energy potential on public lands, both offshore and onshore, especially offshore wind in the Atlantic. And President Biden has said multiple times that he wants to develop these areas for public land, clean energy production, which is great. That's exactly what we need. But now we have to ensure that we have a minimum amount of lease sales done in terms of acreage before renewable energy can get permitted. So that's definitely a big challenge. On top of that, we've also seen just the success in general of oil companies marketing the strategy that if we develop more public lands, it will affect gas prices, which is, for many months have been very high. But we know that that's just not really the case. And that overall, what they're really doing is increasing their profits to record levels. Just recently, many oil companies reported their quarterly profits, and they're, higher than they've ever been. It's because they're essentially just price gouging the American public and saying, just open up more lands, just open up more lands. But I had mentioned earlier, many oil companies have thousands of permits to drill that they're not using because they actually do know that it's, it's beneficial to hold on to them in terms of regulating the price of oil a little bit more in terms of what is worth it for them to develop financially. And, other challenges we've seen at the national level have especially come from the courts. So there's been some recent rulings, both from the Supreme Court, which ruled, in the West Virginia versus EPA case, as well as just other federal court rulings that have done everything from stopping President Biden's leasing pause. When President Biden came into office, he said, I'm going to do a pause right now on issuing new leases. And we were really excited about that to see what was going to be the plan in terms of how he was going to really start phasing this out. And that was overturned by a federal court. And now there's sort of this, judiciary ping pong going on right now between that ruling and whether it's going to stay or not. So those are just some of the kind of the main things that are in the way right now at the federal level. In terms of us as really working at the grassroots level, is that we have to build the political power to change the laws. It's not enough to just say, how do we interpret the laws and how do we interpret? A lot of these laws were written and passed into laws, over 100 years ago. And they were written for a different time. They were written for a time when most people had no idea that climate change was happening. They just didn't know at the time as much. And so now for the 21st century, where we're in a climate emergency, we have to act like it. We can no longer just do the same business as usual that has been happening for centuries. We have to remember that whether the pollution is coming from public lands or private lands, regardless, the climate does not care either way. The climate is not measuring where the pollution is coming from. It's measuring the fact that it's existing overall. And so for our own, government to be contributing to the climate pollution of our country, a quarter of emissions coming from public lands, that's something we have to change immediately. We really have to hold oil and gas companies accountable. And we have to start really at the grassroots level of justly economically transitioning communities off of fossil fuels, who are still, unfortunately, in many places, very much reliant on it for both jobs and also to fund, just local infrastructure and schools. Overall, this transition needs to happen at a fast pace because the climate crisis calls for it. And we have to just really keep pushing and leaning on the Biden administration to do everything that they can, even with the new passage of the Inflation Reduction Act that still mandates leases, still doing everything that they can to get us off fossil fuels as quickly as possible. And if we don't, the scientists have said very clearly, it's not going to be a bright future for all of us. And so we have to really push for this transition and just making sure that we are prioritizing also human health. As Sidnick and Kaylee mentioned, the communities that are most impacted first are the ones who are experiencing the drilling in their backyards, essentially. And that is just, it's simply not fair. We have to really prioritize human health and as well as our climate.
Thanks, Natalie. I know that the Biden-Harris administration early on had prioritized, they emphasized they were prioritizing environmental justice. Can you tell us a little bit about the federal government's role in a just transition?
Absolutely. Environmental justice, it's one of those things that it needs to be in the center of all of our work. In terms of the federal government, I think the main thing is recognizing that a lot of communities have been built around fossil fuels. That's just how it's been for, over 100 years. But recognizing that that cannot continue and that the federal government really does need to step in terms of providing funding to communities so that they don't have to rely on fossil fuel development and continuing expansion of fossil fuel development in order to pay for their schools, in order to pay for their roads, their bridges, and everything else. As Kaylee mentioned, the New Mexico government, very large portion of its income comes from fossil fuels. And that's something that we have to recognize and say, okay, it's not realistic that folks aren't going to have the ability to pay, regular state budgets. We still need those state budgets to be vibrant. But what can the federal government do in terms of filling that gap, even if it's temporarily for maybe 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, in order to ensure that communities can rely on other economic drivers? So I think the federal government has a big role to play in terms of communities coming off of fossil fuels and providing that buffer in terms of funding for state budgets to ensure that they can still be as prosperous as possible. And also just in really investing economically in communities and developing clean energy in places that perhaps former fossil fuel sites. There's, still permitting that needs to happen and obviously studies, but providing clean energy in communities in terms of economic development that can help transition off and the jobs that come with it. Even right now, across the country, there's significantly more clean energy jobs right now than there are fossil fuel jobs. And that's been the case for many years. And so the future is really in clean energy anyway. And with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and the billions of dollars that are going to be going into the production of clean energy, we should start to see even more of a shift soon in economic development across the country, moving more to clean energy.
Thanks, Natalie. For this next question, we're actually going to go back to Cycnic. If you could share a little bit about what just transition efforts may be looking like within your community? And also, from, I think, that future view, what do you want to see? As you noted, or as you may have heard, Natalie shared a bit about, her perspective on where that role is for the federal government. What do you all need for those who may be listening out there from the administration?
Yeah, I think that just transition, as both Natalie and Kaylee had shared, is complicated, but it's also necessary. And some of the efforts that I've seen on a very local level are things like the gardens in the Arctic, which is in Anaktuvuk Pass, that Rainey Hobson has been kind of leading. And that actually has tours going on now. They built a greenhouse, and to paint a picture, it gets, 60, 70 below with the wind chills in the Arctic. So it is harder to obviously have gardens there. And then many groups in Canada are creating renewable energy projects that could potentially be used in the Arctic slope. One of those projects is a massive solar panel project that's built on the Colville River that goes into Canada, but also goes into Nuiqsut and is one of the main sources of food for fish, and where a lot of the caribou go so they can cool off during the hot days. And another, there's an energy atlas in Alaska that shows where potentially we could have alternative energies, and some of those is hydropower or with water. And then the other one is wind power, and that looks promising in many places in the Arctic slope. I think to add on is it's complicated because not just the economic hostage situation that we've been put into, but also looking at the culture that Kaylee spoke to that has just been really put onto the community, that oil and gas is the past, present, and future. It is everything. And as someone growing up in that type of culture, I identified myself with the Native organization that is essentially an oil and gas organization. Instead of saying I was Inupiaq, I identified with the corporation. And this type of mentality, I think, is what our organization has been trying to work on at the core, is having people have the information to make informed decisions and having informed prior consent. I think anyone that was given the full story of saying, hey, if we were to give you these school programs, and at one point there was a Repsol blowout in 2012 and free snow machines were given. These are $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 machines that are being given because 2 children were medevaced and had asthma attacks. And one of the parents was told they actually should move out of the village due to the continued asthma attacks after that blowout. So I think when we're given the informed consent decision saying, hey, if we give you these things, you will also be having a chance that your children will have cancer or respiratory illnesses, people would have said no. And so that's really, I think, the culture of changing and having people have all the information they need and to really present it in a big picture way. And then on top of that, trying to create climate science that's digestible and keeping people high in hopes and not paralyzing them with fear is also something that is very necessary in the just transition movement. I know a lot of young people, including myself, get paralyzed from the climate disaster that we see in front of us. But knowing that we're rooted, the whole reason that we're doing this is because we love people. We love each other, our families, our friends, our children, our aunts and uncles. And we continue to do this work so that we can be with them in relations and community. And so I keep grounded in that. And I think a lot of younger people are starting to ground themselves as well, and knowing that they're doing the best they can every day, and that the next day will provide new opportunities. But we can continue to laugh even in these times that look a little bit like despair. And I'm sorry if you all couldn't hear me. I had my muffled ears.
No, we can absolutely hear you. And I think that's right. Finding, looking for those moments of joy and not holding back on what does create despair. We need to remind ourselves of the whole of these situations. And thank you for sharing that with us. This next audience question is for Kaylee.
It says, Kaylee, have you also seen water pollution as a result of fracking in the Permian Basin? If so, can you talk about that?
Yes, so we have seen water pollution. Of course, produced water, in my opinion, is one of the scariest things about oil and gas production. So as you all know, you have the additives, the chemical additives that the oil companies are not required to disclose in this fluid. And it is also has PFAs in it, so forever chemicals, things like that. But when it comes back up, it is also considered radioactive waste. And there is really no regulation aside from Colorado's T-norm rules that really do anything to address that pollution and the fact that produced water is in fact radioactive. New Mexico has a law that outlaws, dumping of produced water, but again, there's really no enforcement of that. And so we do see water pollution in that sense. And, that has direct impacts on frontline community members. Citizens Caring for the Future, some of the folks that actually helped start it, they lived out in basically the middle of, well, it was south of town, but then the oil field, came and has inundated that region that they were living in. And in January of 2020, they had a produced water line that was across the street from their house. It burst in the middle of the night and it showered their home with produced water, radioactive waste. They ended up having to put their animals down because of radiation exposure, and eventually ended up settling with the company and having to move. And so, water pollution in that sense has a direct impact. The water sources for the particular town that I live in, luckily, are quite a bit north of where the most of the action is in the Permian Basin. But there's other areas, Hobbs, New Mexico. We have heard just through word of mouth, frontline community members talking about, the water comes out yellow, or sometimes I get whelps from when I take a shower, things like that. So it's kind of different for each region depending on where their aquifer is, but we are absolutely seeing water pollution. And kind of, as I mentioned, I think that is personally one of the scariest parts from a health impact standpoint of being in this region.
Thank you so much for really detailing that. I can recall some years ago, there were protected sources of drinking water that also had been contaminated in, places in California. And this, unfortunately is not, it's not the exception. It's really becoming the norm. And so, raising and elevating, the need to talk about these, the need to organize is so vital, as you all have noted. So the next question from the audience is, when organizing in your communities or talking about the threats of oil and gas development, what's been some of the most effective way to get people on board with your message or advocacy efforts? And so, perhaps Kaylee, earlier you shared that where you are at, is really, really conservative areas. So perhaps if you could kind of lean into this question, and then Cyca will also go ahead and want to hear a bit more about what that looks like as you're organizing alongside community. So Kaylee first.
Yeah, as we've noticed, the best way to kind of get through to people is to discuss the health impacts, because as I said, a lot of them are unaware of those health impacts. And so that's where we can really get a dialogue going, or more so just, tell us your story. And a lot of people end up telling you these tragic stories about, people in their family being sick, things like that. And then just being able to gently kind of connect the dots. And something Cyca said really resonated with me, because I feel it a lot too, the paralysis from climate change, paralyzing people in fear, but also as frontline community members, it's paralyzing when you learn about the health impacts of all of these environmental things going around you. And so I try to be really careful in speaking to folks, making sure that we can provide them, some kind of solace, somewhere to turn, something that they can do to begin to protect themselves. Although it is a rural area at the end of the day. And so the healthcare infrastructure isn't what it should be. And so that's something that we need, federal government and stuff like that. We need better resources, better healthcare resources in rural areas, more affordable healthcare. And but that's what we've noticed, the kind of easiest way to break through to people. And as I mentioned, that we are in a very conservative area. And extremism, you can really see it on the rise here. And so we try to be really careful and, not push people if they don't necessarily want to speak out, things like that, because they can be quite hesitant and there can be quite a bit of blowback. So it's just a delicate balance, and really coming from a place of listening first, and then if there's any way to help, being that helping hand in some way.
Thank you. Cyca?
Yeah, I think the most effective way for our community, and being someone that lives in Fairbanks, which is quite a bit of ways from Nuiqsut and Utqiagvik and the North Slope, being able to go and listen to the community members who can be ostracized, blacklisted from jobs if they speak out, all sorts of repercussions beyond, sometimes even being disowned by their family members and their friends. So one of the ways that we're able to get the message out is by listening to them personally, and then spreading that message more anonymously on our webpage, on our social media platforms, and allowing those voices to be uplifted without putting them in a dangerous place. And then also having events like film screenings that give a lot of intense emotional information, but also do typically have some type of light or good message at the end. And one of those films is Project Chariot, that really opened up eyes, I think, to facts given instead of opinions necessarily, and just stating that these are the health ailments that we are seeing. This is what is predominantly produced, by the oil and gas, the pollutants and toxics. These are some of the effects that you might have. And then asking the community, listening to their stories is really, I think the biggest thing is that people are disempowered in many rural communities and many small communities. They have advocacy groups that are on more of a national level that speak for them. Or unfortunately, what we've seen in the past in a lot of like what you might call like green colonization is environmental groups coming in. They get these victories of stopping oil and gas or extraction, and then they leave. And then suddenly these communities are left with nothing. And it's caused a lot of distrust. So I think creating that trust and really listening to, like what I had said before, the message that Nuiqsut had about the Willow Project is building that community. And it's really a long-term situation. It's not something that we can come in for 2 weeks, get to know people, and then suddenly they trust us. So I think having the patience, knowing you're in this for the long haul, and having that passion behind what you're doing it really shows.
Thank you. I think it's really good to be able to hear it at these levels, and also to know, what does that look like? Again, that greenwashing, right? I think a lot of us have seen it. Environmental justice in some ways has become the new kale. There's these things, right, that like inherently are part of our lives that are somehow, these moments during those victories. So I think, again, for the audience, this is the moment when you all work alongside, make sure on that Willow Project, make sure in the Permian Basin that we're starting to see a lot of energy, activity, and support for our colleagues that are here today with us. And then, as we look, to go ahead and wind down, recognizing our time has gone by incredibly quick. We've got about 6 minutes. I'd love to hear a little bit about, how do you all find your moment of the re-energizing moment? Like, where can you just hit like reset? Because for organizers who may be out there listening, hyperlocal community organizers, before they hit the burnout moment, like what do you all do? How can we make sure that folks are really focused on their mental health and energy? Because we know that's so important to being able to continue in this work. So that'd be Cyca, Kaylee, if any of y'all would like to answer, we'll go ahead and, we'll open that up. Natalie, if you have ideas as well, would love to hear that.
Yeah, for me, it's just really being in community, with my family and things like that. That's how I hit the reset button. And also just kind of trying to step away from anything that pertains to, climate change, environmental justice issues, things like that. Getting off of Twitter for, a few hours a day, just really simple things. That's kind of how I just keep myself, grounded. But then also the community of as I mentioned, organizing here can be a little bit hard sometimes because of the culture, and but connecting with folks that are kind of like-minded, and that always is refreshing. And hearing people's stories, that's really what I would say too gives me the most reset, if that makes sense. There are so many people that feel alone and disempowered, and just need to be validated, and being able to listen and, you know, just validate people's experience for them. We speak with folks who say things like, you know, I mentioned that my husband was sick with cancer. I mentioned to his doctor that it could be associated with the fact that he works in the oil and gas industry, and his doctor told me, no chance, don't even say that. And, you know, this woman, it just broke her heart, and being able to say, no, you were right, and you shouldn't have been invalidated like that, is something that is it's something that I'm lucky to be able to do for people.
I'd say being really engulfed in my culture, a lot of, you know, this is an Indigenous-led organization, and a lot of what we were doing was saying no to things, rejecting things, being very combative, if you want to say. But one of the other ways that we like to give back is by holding cultural classes, seal oil lamp classes. And the biggest way personally, on a smaller level, is eating nikipek, which is translated into real food. And that's our whale, caribou, seal. And it really reminds me what I'm fighting for, and that we've been eating, you know, whale mukduck for centuries and centuries, and that might be in history books very soon if we have something, you know. So I just get to enjoy that, and then I get to give it to my kids. So I think having family and friends to be able to share food with that maybe grows naturally in your area is something that really feels grounding to me.
I think for me, just thinking of, you know, staying in this fight, this climate fight, it's a difficult thing. You know, it can be draining, it can be weary. Sometimes you're not sure if you're really making that difference, but in the end, you have no choice. There's nothing else that you can do. You're fighting for the survival of your entire human species and every other species on Earth. And you can't go down and say, well, you know, I tried my best, but it wasn't good enough. You still have to try. I think it's just mainly knowing that it's a marathon, not a sprint. And even though we are in a climate emergency, we are in a place where we have never been in human history before, rivers drying up all around us, all over the world, at the same time, floods, fires, you know, places that had fires in May are now flooded, in New Mexico and other places. I think it's just recognizing that you are going to make that difference along with not just you, but millions of other people that join you, and just holding strong and knowing that sometimes progress seems slow, but you're still making progress. And just taking breaks. You know, this weekend, I'm going to go to Shenandoah National Park because it's a gorgeous weekend, and you should just take that moment to see the beauty that you still have all around you, and knowing that it's something that you're pushing for. As Signic said, you know, knowing what you're fighting for and remembering it and having that. So when I go outside, I remember this is why I spend most of my day inside on Zoom, because I'm pushing for these things to stay with us so that it's not what we used to have, it's what we will continue to have. So just, yeah, taking that balance, that time, and knowing that it's definitely a marathon, and that we're going to transition off of fossil fuels, and we're going to have a clean energy economy everywhere in the world. And it's inevitable, but we have to make it happen right away.
Yeah, thank you so much, Natalie, Signic, Kaylee, for sharing the ways that you all continue to stay inspired. And also, I love just this reflection of food and culture and how we can just bring something, you know, something we can each share going forward. So again, thank you so much. I really enjoyed having this conversation. I think as we close down, one of the things we want to leave our audience with is really ways to get involved. So again, thank you for staying with us. Thank you to each of these panelists for sharing their expertise, their knowledge, their hearts, and their minds with us. For those who feel compelled to act, there are specific ways that you can take action and to get involved right now. So one immediate way is to submit a comment to the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM, opposing the Willow the Willow Project. As Cyca noted, that's happening in the Western Arctic. So you'll soon see a link in the chat that has an action page where you can go ahead, make sure you take action, you get involved. It'll take just mere minutes. So please, this is something that we can all do today. And then as we look forward, in addition to submitting, that comment, we can also, learn more about other campaigns that the Sovereign Inupiat for a Living Arctic, Citizens Caring for the Future, and the Wilderness Society are working on. So soon you will see in the chat as well, all of those websites. So you can go ahead and explore if you really feel compelled to, donate, help to, continue moving this work, accelerating this work forward. And if you'd like to connect with anyone here today, please send an email to webinars@tws.org, and they'll make sure that the appropriate person receives the message. So again, that's webinars@tws.org. We did record today's session. It will be available on the Wilderness Society's YouTube. So you'll also receive a follow-up email that includes that recording of today's conversation. And then again, just a tremendous amount of thanks and, love to each of the people who've been here on this panel for the great conversation, to you all for listening so deeply, and again to the Wilderness Society for hosting us. Well, that's really all we have time for today. So as some family members of mine would tell me as I would head out the door, now go out and make a difference in the world. So make sure that you take good care of your hearts, your minds, and do all our personal best, as we've heard from our panelists today. So thanks so much for joining us, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.